Michael Jordan returns to stadium alone and watches his final game in silence. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The arena stood quiet, the lights dimmed, and the echoes of a past glory filled the air. Michael Jordan entered the empty stadium, his steps deliberate, each one carrying the weight of history. It had been years since he'd set foot here, the place that had witnessed his greatest triumphs and his final departure from the game he'd revolutionized. Today, however, was different. He was alone, a figure that had once captivated millions now walking through the shadows of memories, each step bringing him closer to a moment he had never fully processed. The hardwood beneath his feet was familiar, yet foreign. The echoes of his iconic shots, the roars of the crowd, the pressure of those high-stakes games, they all seemed to rise up around him, filling the empty space with their ghosts. But the silence was different now. The stadium, which once had the pulse of an entire city, was now just a hollow shell, a monument to what once was. He walked to the center of the court and stood still, his gaze fixed on the spot where he had delivered some of the most iconic plays in basketball history. It was surreal. This was the same court where he had made his final shot as a Chicago Bull, where he had hoisted his sixth championship trophy, and where he had said goodbye to a city, a sport, and a legacy. Now, it was just him. No fans. No teammates. No opponents. Just the lingering hum of memories. Jordan's career had been filled with moments that transcended the game, his clutch performances, his fierce rivalries, and the way he had carried the weight of expectations on his shoulders like no one else before or after him. The world had watched as he conquered everything in his path, dominating the NBA with an intensity that seemed untouchable. But now, standing here, in this empty arena, he was forced to confront the part of his career that had always been in the background, the emotional toll, the sacrifices, the parts of the story that weren't often told. Years had passed since his final game in this very arena. A game that was filled with the emotion of a career that had seen its final chapter. He had walked off the court one last time, his jersey still tucked in, his sweat still on the floor, but there was a finality in his steps. Even as he had lifted his sixth championship, it had been clear that he was done. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. That decision was made with clarity, or so he had believed at the time. He had been worn down by the weight of the game, the pressure, and the toll it had taken on him both physically and mentally. It wasn't just the game that had shaped him. It was the sacrifices he had made, the relationships he had lost, and the person he had become in the process. Jordan had always been known for his ruthless competitiveness, his unmatched desire to win, and his ability to elevate himself and his team in moments of crisis. But what the world hadn't always seen was the human side of the man, the struggles, the doubts, the insecurities that came with being the face of a global brand, a living legend. There had always been a price to pay, and now, standing in the same spot where it had all ended, Jordan could feel the weight of it again. He closed his eyes for a moment and allowed the memories to flood back, the sound of the ball bouncing on the hardwood, the feeling of the ball in his hands, the sweat dripping down his face during a particularly brutal game. He could almost hear the roar of the crowd during his final shot in the 1998 finals, the moment that sealed his legacy. It was a moment he would never forget, but now, with no one else around, it felt like it was locked in time, preserved in a way that wasn't as easily accessible when he was living it. The physical strain, the mental exhaustion, the pressure, none of that seemed to matter in the heat of the moment, but now, in the quiet of the arena, it all came rushing back. Jordan had made his choice to retire, again. The first time, after the death of his father, was filled with uncertainty. His life had been shattered, and basketball had felt like a distant memory. But when he returned, it was clear he had come back with a vengeance, determined to reclaim his place at the top. Yet, by the time his second retirement came around, it felt different. He was no longer just a player, he was an icon, a symbol of greatness that the world would never quite be able to replicate. And yet, there was something inside him that had been yearning for closure, for peace, for the end of an era that he had helped create. As he stood alone on the court, Jordan couldn't help but feel a quiet sadness. It wasn't regret, but it was a quiet acknowledgement of how much he had given to the game. He had poured everything into his career, but now, in the stillness, he could finally process the emotions that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. Basketball had been his life, his obsession, his everything. And while he had left it behind years ago, part of him still couldn't fully let go. The quiet of the arena seemed to reflect that part of him that had always struggled to leave. Even now, with his career long over, Jordan found himself returning to this place, haunted by the echoes of his past. His last game had been more than just the final shot, it had been the end of something larger. A part of him had always known that this day would come. The day when he would walk away for good. But another part of him, a part that had driven him to be the best, had always wondered if he could have done more. The truth was, Jordan didn't know if he was ever going to get the answers he sought. He had been the king of basketball for so long, and in many ways, it felt like he had conquered it all. But deep down, the finality of his departure had left him with questions that could never be answered. Could he have played longer? Could he have won more? What more could he have given to the game? These questions lingered, not as regrets, but as unfinished thoughts. In this empty arena, with only the echoes of his past, Jordan could finally confront those questions. He could allow himself the time to reflect, to feel, to understand. And as he walked slowly off the court, taking one last look at the empty seats and the court that had once been his home, he felt a strange peace. It wasn't closure, exactly, but it was something. A sense that, after all these years, he had finally made peace with the end. And for the first time in a long time, Michael Jordan allowed himself to stop looking back. He could walk away, knowing he had given everything to the game, and that, in the end, was enough. Michael Jordan stood still at the center of the court, the floor beneath his feet a familiar friend, now carrying the weight of decades of memories. The gym was empty, just a hollow shell of the electric atmosphere that used to pulse through its walls. The echoes of the crowd, the squeaks of sneakers on the hardwood, the slam of a dunk, it was all gone, replaced by the eerie silence that only time could bring. But as Jordan stood there, he wasn't just reflecting on his past. There was something else stirring inside him, something he hadn't fully allowed himself to process before. He had given everything to the game, blood, sweat, tears. He had poured his soul into every dribble, every shot, every game. And yet, even now, as he stood in the same arena where he had secured his 6th championship and made countless unforgettable plays, he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe it was peace, maybe it was closure, or maybe it was just the ability to fully embrace the end of a chapter he had never fully let go of. Jordan had been out of the game for years, but walking into this empty arena felt like stepping back in time. He could see the faces of his teammates, his opponents, the fans, it was all there in his mind, vivid and alive. It was as if the memories had been stored in the very fabric of the building, ready to rush back the moment he returned. But there was something different now. The intensity, the passion that had once driven him to be the greatest player to ever play the game was quieter, softer, and far more introspective. It was strange. The energy that once defined him, the competitiveness, the fire to prove himself, was still there, but it had shifted. Now, standing in this arena that had once been his kingdom, the competitive nature that had defined his career didn't feel like it was calling to him anymore. It had been replaced by something else, a quiet understanding that he had done it all. He had conquered the game in a way no one else ever would. And that realization brought with it an unexpected peace. Jordan had been through so much in his career. He'd seen both the highest highs and the lowest lows, from the triumphs of championships to the devastating loss of his father, which had led him to step away from the game and pursue baseball. He had returned to the NBA with a vengeance, leading the Chicago Bulls to another three-peat, only to retire for a second time. But each of those retirements had been different. The first time, he had walked away because he needed to, because life had taken him in a different direction. The second time, though, had been his choice. He had left on his own terms, but the decision had been filled with its own set of questions. What else could he have accomplished? What else could he have given to the game? As Jordan stood there, he remembered the exhaustion that had set in by the end of his career. The physical toll, the mental fatigue, it had all come to a head in the 1998 season, during The Last Dance. The final shot in the finals, the one that secured his sixth title with the Bulls, had been bittersweet. The exhilaration of victory was still fresh, but deep down, Jordan knew that it would be his last game in Chicago. It was the end of an era, and he had walked away, knowing it was time. But even though he had left the game, the memories never really left him. He had moved on to other projects, business ventures, ownership, mentoring the next generation of players, but none of it had ever filled the void basketball had left. The game had been his identity, and though he had crafted an empire outside of basketball, there was always a part of him that wondered if he had truly let go of it. Standing there, in the quiet solitude of the arena, Jordan felt something shift. The arena had been the backdrop for every major triumph of his career, but now it was a place of reflection, a place to look back without the noise of the game or the expectations that came with it. The question of what now loomed over him like a shadow. What had his career really meant? What was the legacy he had built beyond the statistics and the rings? Over the years, Jordan had seen the wave of younger players, each one trying to live up to the standard he had set. Some succeeded, some didn't. But all of them, at least for a time, had to contend with the shadow of Michael Jordan. And yet, as time went on, Jordan had begun to understand that his legacy wasn't about being an impossible standard. It wasn't about trying to be the perfect player or the flawless competitor. It was about the moments, those fleeting seconds when he had taken over a game, when he had inspired his teammates, when he had left everything on the floor. But perhaps the most significant legacy Jordan had left was the culture of greatness he had built around him. He had shown the world what it meant to be committed, to push beyond your limits, to be relentless in your pursuit of perfection. And for all the stories and the highlights, that was the true measure of his impact. It wasn't just in the games he had won, but in the mindset he had instilled in others. He had changed the way the world saw basketball, and in many ways, the way the world saw athletes. Jordan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but as the footsteps grew louder, he turned around to see a familiar face. It was Phil Jackson, his coach during the Bulls' 6 championships. The two exchanged a knowing look, one that didn't need words. The history between them, the countless hours spent working together, the moments of tension and triumph, they were all part of this larger story they had written together. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here," Phil said with a smile. "It's been a long time." Jordan chuckled. "Yeah. Thought I might give it a visit. Guess it's still hard to leave, even after all these years." Phil nodded. "You know, the game never really leaves you. It becomes part of you. But you've done what no one else could. You've changed the sport. And that's something that'll never go away." Jordan's gaze softened as he looked out at the court once more. "I know. I guess I just needed to be here, one last time, to really take it all in. To understand what it all meant." They stood there together, in silence, just taking it in, the history, the weight of the past, and the understanding that time had moved on. There was no need for grand speeches or final words. They had shared their moments, and they had built something that was never meant to be replicated. In that moment, Jordan didn't need closure or answers. He had already given everything to the game, and in return, the game had given him a place in history. Phil placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've earned your peace, Michael. It's time." Jordan nodded slowly, the weight lifting off his shoulders. He had given everything, and now, he could walk away in a way he had never allowed himself to before. As they walked out of the arena together, the doors closing behind them, Jordan finally felt a sense of contentment. It wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the journey, the relationships, and the understanding that the impact he had made would last forever. The court may have been empty, but the legacy would live on, in every player who followed and in every fan who remembered what it meant to witness greatness. The lights flickered slightly as Jordan made his way back to the court, each step resonating with the weight of history. This was where it had all started, and where it had all ended, his incredible run with the Chicago Bulls. But in this moment, alone, he was no longer the player who had dominated the NBA for years. He was simply a man who had once walked these floors, a man whose legacy had been built in this very arena, and whose greatest achievements now seemed like part of a distant past. The arena still smelled faintly of sweat, of the familiar scent that had once filled the space during every game. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the memories wash over him, the fast breaks, the alley-oops, the championship celebrations. There was a certain reverence in those memories, an almost sacred quality to the way he had approached every game. But now, with the court empty, those memories had taken on a new tone, one of reflection. He stopped near the free-throw line, the spot where so many of his clutch moments had unfolded. From here, he had won titles, made countless game-winning shots, and elevated his team to greatness. He could almost hear the rhythm of the ball bouncing, the roar of the crowd, and then the calm as he stood at the line in the final seconds of a crucial game. But now, there was only silence. What he was feeling, standing here alone, was not regret or nostalgia, it was something more complex. He had given everything to basketball. He had been the face of the NBA, the standard by which all other players were measured. But in this moment, he wasn't thinking about the championships, the accolades, or the records. He was thinking about the journey itself, the sacrifices, the pressures, the toll it had taken. The reality was, while he had climbed higher than any player before him, there had always been something lurking in the background, a question of what he had left behind in the pursuit of greatness. Jordan had always been defined by his intensity, his desire to win at any cost. But the price of that drive had been more than just physical fatigue, it had been emotional exhaustion, the constant pressure to maintain perfection, to never show weakness. Even when he retired, the game never fully let him go. Basketball was part of him, in a way that was hard to describe. He had given it everything, but there were still moments, even years after he had left the game, when he wondered if he could have done more, played longer, or achieved something even greater. He turned and looked up at the empty seats, the bleachers that had once been packed with fans. He could still see their faces, people who had cheered for him, and some who had cheered against him. The passion they had for the game, for him as a player, had been something he had never taken for granted. They had followed his career through all the ups and downs, through the highs of championships and the lows of personal tragedy, always supporting him, always believing. Jordan hadn't just been a player to them, he had been a hero. But in this quiet, empty arena, with only the memories to keep him company, he wasn't sure if he was still the same person who had once felt invincible. The man who had walked away from the game in 1999, who had taken a brief break and returned again in 2001 with the Washington Wizards, was a different version of the man who had stood on this court, lifting trophies with his teammates. The years had changed him. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the change hadn't been entirely negative. His second stint with the Wizards had been a farewell of sorts, not just to the NBA but to the version of himself that had defined his career. He had left the Bulls with everything he could give, but by the time he came back, he was no longer the same explosive force he had been in his prime. He wasn't the man who could take over games at will. He was a veteran, someone with experience but also with a body that had begun to show signs of wear. But even then, when the media questioned his decision to return, when critics argued that he was tarnishing his legacy, Jordan didn't flinch. He still believed in his ability to contribute, to lead, to inspire. That belief in himself, and his skills, was as much a part of him as the drive that had pushed him to greatness in his prime. But now, standing here alone, those doubts, those quiet, nagging questions, seemed more real than ever. Had he overstayed his welcome in the game? Had he walked away too early, or was it the right time? He'd never really allowed himself to ask those questions while he was playing. He'd been too focused on the next challenge, the next victory, the next championship. But now, the silence of the empty stadium allowed him to confront them. What made this moment even more profound was the absence of the crowd. In his final games, the fans had been everything, their cheers, their chants, their support had fueled his performance. They had been part of the story, part of his identity as a player. But now, with no one to cheer, there was only him and the court, just two pieces of a puzzle that had once been part of something larger. It felt like the final stage of a process that had started years ago, but one that never quite ended. Jordan had always been known for his ability to perform under pressure, for his relentless pursuit of greatness, and for his unshakable confidence. But standing in this arena, in this quiet moment of reflection, he understood that greatness wasn't just about the accolades or the championships, it was about the journey itself, about how much you gave of yourself and how much you were willing to sacrifice to achieve what others thought impossible. And even now, as he looked back at the career he had built, he realized that the true measure of greatness lay not just in the moments of triumph, but in the quiet moments when you had to face the truth about what it took to get there. As Jordan walked toward the bench where he had once sat, his eyes landed on the worn-out basketball, the same one he had used during countless practices, countless drills. The ball was no longer just a tool, it was a symbol, a reminder of everything he had poured into the game. It was a constant companion throughout his career, one that had never faltered, never let him down. And now, even though he had walked away from the court, it still held meaning. There was a part of him that wondered if anyone would ever come along who could do what he had done, achieve what he had achieved. But then, as he held the ball in his hands for just a moment longer, he realized that it didn't matter. His place in history was secure, not because of the records or the victories, but because of the path he had forged for the next generation. Michael Jordan had been the standard. And no matter who came after him, that standard would never fade. As he left the court, Jordan took one last look around, the silence in the arena now feeling like a companion rather than an adversary. He had done everything he could for the game, for himself, and for those who had followed his journey. And with that, he walked away, not with regrets or unanswered questions, but with a deep sense of peace. He had given everything he had, and that, in the end, was enough. Michael Jordan stood at the edge of the court, staring at the center logo, where so many iconic moments in his career had unfolded. The echoes of roaring crowds, the sound of his feet pounding against the hardwood, and the rhythm of the game were distant now, leaving only the quiet hum of his own thoughts. The arena had been his battleground, his stage, where he had become an international icon and one of the most famous athletes in the world. Now, in this empty space, he had the room to breathe, to reflect, to face the truth of his departure. In his prime, the intensity of the game had never let him pause. Every game was a challenge, every series an opportunity to prove that he was the best. But as his career wound down, Jordan found himself fighting a different kind of battle, one against time, against the physical toll the game had taken on his body, and against the unrelenting expectations he had carried for so long. The idea of retirement, though inevitable, had never been easy to accept. As he walked slowly across the court, the memories began to blur. The competitive fire that had once burned so brightly now seemed like a distant echo, something that had driven him for years but no longer defined him. When he had first retired in 1993, it had been a way to step away from the game and the pressures that had accumulated. The passing of his father had made the decision feel necessary. He needed space to breathe, to figure out who he was beyond the game of basketball. His return was sparked by an itch that he hadn't realized existed. But by the time his second retirement arrived, in 1999, it felt different. The game had changed, and so had he. By 1998, when the Chicago Bulls had finished their last season of dominance, Jordan had already achieved everything there was to achieve. 6 championships, countless accolades, and moments that transcended sports. But still, it hadn't been enough to completely silence the part of him that always sought more. Retirement, though inevitable, hadn't been something he was fully ready for. The decision to leave was made in the heat of the moment, after another emotional and grueling season with the Bulls. The Last Dance had been everything Jordan had ever hoped for and more, until it wasn't. It had been the culmination of a career, a final shot at glory. But what came after the confetti fell, after the celebrations ended, was quieter than Jordan had expected. The weight of his departure, the emotional toll of leaving something he had given everything to, crept in. This wasn't just a career that had ended, it was a piece of his identity that had been left behind. Michael Jordan wasn't just a basketball player. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of excellence and success. He had spent his entire life building that image, forging an identity that was both celebrated and scrutinized. Walking away from that was no easy task. The questions, the doubts, the uncertainties, they followed him, even after he hung up his sneakers for the last time. But there was more to it than that. Jordan knew the impact he had made on the game. He knew he had changed the way basketball was played, the way athletes were viewed, and the way brands interacted with sports. His legacy was set in stone, but it was the quiet moments, like the one he was living through now, that allowed him to see it all clearly. As he stood at the center of the court, the weight of that legacy sat heavily on his shoulders. It was a responsibility that he had taken on from the very beginning, one that he had shouldered without hesitation. But now, after all these years, it was time to let go of the constant pressure, the expectations. It was time to accept that his career, though monumental, was over. The first time he retired, he had needed to step away, to find peace in a different form, outside of basketball. Baseball had seemed like the answer. He had to prove something to himself, and maybe even to the world. But when he came back, he wasn't the same player. His body had changed. The game had changed. But one thing hadn't changed: his drive, his hunger. Even in the later years of his career, when he had returned to the NBA as an older player with the Washington Wizards, that fire still burned inside him. He still had the confidence, the ability to take over a game when it mattered. But the joy had started to fade, and the pressure of the spotlight had started to feel like a burden. What Jordan had never fully realized was how much of his life had been defined by the game. It wasn't just the fame or the championships. It was the constant rhythm, the daily grind, the singular focus that basketball had demanded from him. When he left the game for good, he left behind not just a sport, but an entire way of life. The question that had plagued him for so long had finally been answered. It wasn't about basketball anymore. It was about finding peace. That day in 1998, when Jordan walked off the court for the last time as a Chicago Bull, he thought he had closed that chapter for good. He had won his 6th championship, cemented his legacy, and proved once again that he was the greatest player to ever play the game. But as time had passed, he found himself searching for something more. It was as if the final buzzer had never sounded completely. There was always more to prove, more to accomplish, and Jordan couldn't help but wonder what it all meant in the grand scheme of things. But standing on that court now, years removed from his final game, he realized something. All those years of struggle, of sacrifice, of victories and defeats, they had built him into the man he was today. The endless drive to win, the countless hours of practice, the need to be perfect, they had shaped him in ways he could never have predicted. But now, it was time to accept that the pursuit of greatness was never going to be fulfilled in the way he had imagined. Greatness wasn't something you could touch or measure. It wasn't about the rings or the records. It was about what you left behind, what you inspired in others, and how you changed the world. Jordan turned around and walked slowly toward the locker room. The court, with all its memories, slowly faded into the background. As he passed the rows of empty seats, he could almost hear the faint murmur of the crowd, the rush of the game that had once consumed him. But now, that noise had become distant, like a memory fading in the distance. He was no longer the player who had defined a generation of basketball fans. But he was still Michael Jordan, the man who had changed the game, the icon who had taken basketball to new heights. And though the court had been left behind, his influence would continue long after the lights had gone out. As he stepped into the locker room, the door closing softly behind him, Jordan allowed himself one last breath of relief. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. And in that moment, with the past settled and the future waiting, he finally allowed himself to let go. The quiet of the arena surrounded Michael Jordan as he continued to walk, each step carrying him further from the past, yet closer to an understanding that had always eluded him. The sound of his shoes on the court echoed through the empty space. He'd spent years walking on courts, surrounded by thousands of people, but here, now, it was just him and the memories. He couldn't help but feel that the absence of the crowd, the absence of the pressure, the constant roar of the game, allowed him to finally hear the truth that had always been buried deep inside him. His mind raced back to those final days with the Chicago Bulls. The decision to retire a second time had been as much about a feeling in his gut as it had been about physical exhaustion. The thrill had started to fade. Basketball, which had once been the center of his universe, had started to feel like an unrelenting cycle, one that demanded more from him than he was willing to give. There had been the euphoria of winning, of constantly proving himself, but there had also been an immense weight, the constant scrutiny, the expectations that came with being the best. Even at the pinnacle, Jordan had felt the pressure mounting. And though he had walked away from the game twice, that question, that itch to return, had always lingered. When he came back with the Washington Wizards, people saw it as a chance for redemption, for Jordan to prove that he was still the man. But even in those years, he wasn't the same player. He still had flashes of brilliance, moments when he would remind everyone why he was the greatest. But it was clear to him, as he played those final years, that he had already given everything to the game. The second return hadn't been about proving himself. It had been about something else, finding a way to say goodbye, not just to basketball, but to an identity he had built for himself. Now, standing alone in this arena, he realized that he hadn't truly let go of basketball. It had always been a part of him, and perhaps it always would be. But the truth was, he was no longer that player, the one who dominated games, the one who needed to prove something every time he stepped on the floor. He was Michael Jordan, the man, not the icon. And that distinction, though subtle, was something he hadn't fully understood until this moment. Jordan moved to the sideline and leaned against the bench, his eyes scanning the floor. The game had given him everything: fame, fortune, recognition. But it had also taken something from him. He had spent his entire career focused on winning, on being the best, but there had been personal sacrifices along the way. His relationships with family and friends had suffered. He had missed birthdays, graduations, and moments that could never be recaptured. The game had required all of him, and in return, it had made him the most famous athlete in the world. But now, in this quiet moment, he was left to consider what he had lost in the pursuit of greatness. For so many years, his identity had been bound up in basketball. He had been MJ to the world, the relentless competitor who never gave up, the one who could always be counted on in the clutch. But who was he outside of the game? When the crowds were gone, when the lights went out, who was he then? It wasn't a question that had ever really mattered to him during his playing days. He had known who he was a champion, a leader, a competitor. But now, looking at the empty stands, it was clear that there was a part of him that had been lost in that identity. It had been years since he last played a competitive game, and the truth was, he had never fully come to terms with his retirement. His legacy, though solidified with 6 NBA championships and countless accolades, had always hung over him. Every time a new player came along with a signature move, or someone was crowned the next Jordan, he felt that familiar tug. It wasn't about jealousy or bitterness, it was about the realization that, despite everything he had accomplished, there was always someone new, someone fresh, threatening to overshadow him. But now, in this quiet arena, Jordan had the space to understand something important: his place in basketball history was secure. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. It wasn't about who could replace him, it was about the journey he had taken and the people he had inspired along the way. He had shown a generation of players what was possible, and that influence would continue long after he was gone. There was a moment of clarity as he looked at the empty arena. The lights dimmed further, casting long shadows on the court. The place that had once been filled with noise, excitement, and drama now stood still. The familiar sounds of dribbling basketballs and sneakers squeaking on the hardwood were gone, replaced by the quiet hum of his thoughts. And in this moment of solitude, Jordan realized that, in some ways, this emptiness was what he needed. He had spent so many years being the center of attention, the focus of every conversation, every headline. Now, in this moment, he could just be Michael, the man who had played the game, the man who had loved it, and the man who had walked away when it was time. The silence wasn't a burden anymore. It was peaceful. There was no one waiting for him to deliver one more game-winning shot. No one expecting him to be the relentless competitor, the hero who saved the day. There was only him in the court, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to embrace the quiet, the calm that came with knowing he had already given everything he had to the sport. Jordan turned and walked back to the bench, sitting down for a moment and looking at the court once more. He thought about the players who had come after him, the ones who had learned from him, watched him, and then built their own legacies. He thought about the younger athletes who wore his shoes, who idolized him not just for his skill, but for the way he had carried himself both on and off the court. His impact on the game was undeniable, but perhaps what he was beginning to understand was that his legacy wasn't just about basketball. It was about the way he had taught others to rise above their circumstances, to overcome adversity, and to chase greatness with everything they had. As he stood up, ready to leave the court for the final time, he felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't the closure he had been seeking for years. It wasn't some grand realization that made everything fall into place. It was simply a quiet understanding that he had done everything he could. He had been the player, the leader, the competitor. And now, he could finally rest, knowing that his story had been written, and that the world had witnessed his greatness. Jordan walked off the court for the last time, the echo of his footsteps fading behind him. The arena, though silent, would forever hold the memories of his greatest moments. And Michael Jordan, the man who had changed the game, had finally walked away in peace. As Michael Jordan made his way toward the locker room, his footsteps echoed in the cavernous space of the arena. The air was still, almost suffocating in its quiet. The energy that had once fueled the stadium, the tension before a big game, the roar of the crowd after a clutch shot, was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of finality. Yet, the absence of that noise gave him room to think, to process, to feel. The legacy he had built wasn't just about winning titles or establishing dominance on the court, it was about the impact he had made on the game, on the lives of those who watched him, and on those who aspired to be like him. Jordan had always been focused on the task at hand. Throughout his career, every game, every play, every moment had been about winning, about proving that he was the best. His mind had been constantly occupied by the next challenge, the next hurdle to overcome. But now, in this moment of solitude, he was able to reflect on something much larger. He had given everything to the game, but the game had also given him something. A place in history. A legacy. But more than that, it had given him the platform to inspire others to reach for greatness. But the truth, as he stood there in the empty locker room, was that he wasn't just defined by basketball anymore. He was a symbol, one that had transcended the sport. As much as he had defined the game during his time on the court, the game itself had helped shape him into the person he was. It had tested him, broken him, and made him rise from the ashes time and time again. The victories were not just victories, they were the result of his resilience, his drive, his refusal to be anything less than the best. He had faced down adversity, both on the court and off, and had emerged victorious every time. That, he realized, was what made him who he was. Jordan had been through so many ups and downs in his career. He had started in North Carolina, where he had learned the fundamentals of the game. He had faced rejection in high school, when he was cut from his varsity team, an experience that had fueled the fire inside him to prove everyone wrong. He had faced setbacks, both personal and professional, from the loss of his father to the struggles he had faced on his way back to the top after retiring the first time. Yet, through it all, he had never given up. That relentless drive, that determination to overcome any obstacle, was what had made him the best. But standing in the locker room now, with the echoes of his career lingering in the walls, Jordan understood something deeper. He had always been defined by his competition, by the challenges he faced on the court, and by the victories he had achieved. But now, it wasn't about the games anymore. It wasn't about proving he was better than everyone else. It was about understanding that he had already proven everything he needed to. His place in history was secure. His legacy was intact. As Jordan sat down on the bench, he let his mind wander back to the moments that had defined his career. He remembered his first championship with the Bulls, the excitement of finally breaking through after years of coming up short. He thought about the late-night practices, the countless hours spent honing his skills, the intensity with which he approached every game. He remembered the moments of joy, the moments of defeat, the moments of triumph. Every one of those moments had led him to this point, and every one of those moments had been a part of the story that had made him who he was. The final shot in the 1998 finals, the one that sealed his legacy as the greatest player of all time, had been the culmination of everything he had worked for. It had been a moment of perfect closure, the final step in a journey that had begun when he was just a young boy trying to make his way in the world. But the truth was, it hadn't felt like the end. Even as the confetti fell and the crowd erupted into cheers, there had been a part of him that hadn't been ready to walk away. The game had become a part of his soul. It had been his everything for so long, and leaving it behind had been one of the hardest things he had ever done. Now, in the silence of the locker room, Jordan understood that his relationship with basketball wasn't just about playing the game. It was about the lessons it had taught him. The discipline, the focus, the dedication, it was all part of the process. And as much as he had given to the game had given something to him in return, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, and a sense of belonging. It was the thing that had kept him going when everything else seemed to fall apart. He stood up from the bench and walked toward the door, the weight of his final decision pressing on his chest. The game had taught him how to handle pressure, how to thrive under adversity. And now, as he prepared to leave it all behind for good, he was faced with a different kind of pressure. The pressure of finding out who he was outside of the game. For so long, basketball had been everything. But now, as he walked out of that locker room, he realized that there was more to life than just the game. He had spent his entire career building his identity around basketball, but now he would need to learn who he was without it. The world had always known Michael Jordan as the basketball legend, the competitor, the man who could do it all. But there was so much more to him. He had always been a son, a brother, a father. He had always had a life outside of basketball, but for so long, he had been consumed by the game. It was time to move forward, to find a new purpose, a new challenge. He had already done everything he had set out to do. He had proven he was the greatest player of all time, and now it was time to discover what else life had to offer. As he walked down the corridor of the arena for the last time, Jordan felt a strange sense of peace. There was no sense of regret, no longing for the game. There was only a quiet understanding that it was time to move on. He had built something incredible, something that would never be forgotten. His legacy would live on in the hearts and minds of those who had watched him play, in the players who had followed in his footsteps, and in the countless fans who had admired him. Jordan walked out of the arena, the door closing softly behind him. The game, with all its memories and moments, was behind him now. And as he stepped into the future, he carried with him the lessons he had learned, the triumphs he had achieved, and the understanding that his time had come to an end. But in that end, there was a beginning. And as he looked toward what lay ahead, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. As Michael Jordan stood in the shadows of the empty arena, the world outside seemed to fade away. For a moment, there was no crowd, no cameras, no expectations. Just silence. A silence that, in a way, spoke louder than any cheering crowd ever could. It was the kind of silence that only came when something truly important had ended, when the clamor of a lifetime's work had finally quieted. He had been through so much, so many ups, so many downs. The championships. The losses. The comebacks. Each stage had felt like a new chapter, but they all shared one constant theme, the need to prove himself. Over and over again, he had pushed, driven himself to be more than just a player. To be more than just a competitor. He had been relentless, some would say obsessive, in his pursuit of greatness. His name had become synonymous with winning, and for years, that had been enough. But now, standing alone, with only the echoes of his career swirling around him, Jordan could feel the weight of it all. He had always been defined by the game, by his status as the greatest player to ever step onto a basketball court. But who was he without that identity? The question was one he hadn't allowed himself to ask for a long time. And yet, in this stillness, it was impossible to ignore. He had left the game once, after his father's tragic death. He had left the game again, after conquering it one final time with the Chicago Bulls. And yet, even in those moments of departure, he hadn't truly let go. The game had always called him back, and each time, he had answered. But now, with his final farewell to the game, there was no more running. No more comebacks. No more playing for the love of the game or for the pursuit of more trophies. There was only the man who had lived through it all, the man who had left everything on the court. As Jordan walked down the tunnel, he couldn't help but think about the moments that had defined his career. The shots. The plays. The rivalries. The championship wins. The first time he had lifted a title, when he had carried the weight of the Chicago Bulls on his shoulders. The unforgettable flu game. The last shot over Brian Russell in the 1998 finals, a fitting end to a career that had become a legend in its own right. But there had also been the sacrifices, the loneliness, and the internal battles he had fought. He had been the ultimate competitor, but what had that competition cost him? The relentless drive that had fueled his rise to the top had also alienated him from the people he loved. He had lost friendships, relationships, moments of joy. Everything had always come second to the game. That had been the price of greatness. Now, years removed from his playing days, he had come to terms with that. It was no longer about the basketball court or the trophies or the records. It was about the understanding that, in the end, the game had given him everything it could. It had shaped him, but it had also taken from him. But as he looked back on his journey, he saw something different than he had before, a man who had lived fully, who had given it all, and who had nothing left to prove. There was a part of him that wondered, though, if he had truly learned to be content. Content with the idea that, despite everything he had accomplished, there would always be more challenges, more people to impress, more records to break. The question of legacy had followed him for years, and now, standing here, in the quiet aftermath, he knew that his legacy was more than just what he had done on the court. It was the impact he had on the players who followed in his footsteps. The kids who had watched him play and dreamed of being like him. The young athletes who wore his shoes and looked up to him as the standard. His life had been defined by basketball, but now it was time for something else. Time for a new identity. One that wasn't tethered to the game. He had always been Michael Jordan, the player. But now, he could be Michael Jordan, the man. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but he understood that it was time to embrace it. As he left the arena, walking through the back corridors, he passed by the memorabilia, the old jerseys, the trophies that had come to define his career. He didn't need to stop and look at them. He had already made peace with the past. The jerseys, the titles, they were symbols of what he had done, but they didn't define who he was anymore. He had left that part of his life behind. He stepped out into the cool night air, the city of Chicago stretching out before him. The city that had watched him grow from a young, brash player into the greatest basketball player to ever play the game. The city that had cheered for him, carried him, and stood by him through every high and low. And yet, even as he stood there, with the wind in his face and the world at his feet, there was a sense of peace. This was his time to walk away. He had done everything he had set out to do. He had led his team to victory. He had cemented his place in history. But most importantly, he had done it on his terms. The game had always been about control, about making things happen, about imposing his will. But now, in this moment, he realized that the ultimate form of control was knowing when to walk away. Knowing when it was time to let go. He had left the game before, but it had never felt like this. This time, it was different. It wasn't a retreat, a response to loss or tragedy. It was a choice. A conscious decision to close that chapter and start a new one. And as he stood there, breathing in the night air, Jordan felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from the expectations, freedom from the constant scrutiny, freedom from the game. For the first time, Michael Jordan was no longer just a player. He was Michael Jordan, the man who had built a legacy, who had pushed the boundaries of greatness, but who was now free to live life on his own terms. He knew that this freedom came with its own challenges. Life after basketball wasn't as simple as walking away. He had to figure out what came next. But as he stood there, looking out over the city, Jordan knew that he was ready for whatever came next. The game had been everything, but now, there was room for something else. Something new. Something that didn't rely on the applause, the crowds, or the pressure of being the best. And so, with the night settling around him, Michael Jordan walked away, ready to embrace whatever came next in his life. The greatest player to ever play the game had left the court for the last time. And as he walked into the unknown, he felt no fear, no regret. Just the satisfaction of knowing he had given it all. As the weeks turned into months, Michael Jordan's life began to shift. The quiet peace he had felt after stepping away from basketball gradually gave way to a new kind of uncertainty. His world had been so tightly interwoven with the game for so long that now, without it, he was left to redefine himself. No longer was he the relentless competitor who always had something to prove. No longer was he the player who had inspired generations with his grace and tenacity on the court. He was just a man now, free of the game, but unsure of what came next. Jordan had always been someone who thrived under pressure, who reveled in competition, who found meaning in the constant pursuit of excellence. The game had been his everything for most of his life, and now, without it, there was a void. The question that had plagued him during his retirement was still present: what now? During his playing days, basketball had consumed him. It was what he woke up for, what he lived for. His entire identity had been shaped by the court. It was where he found his purpose. When he stepped away for the first time after his father's death, he had thought that perhaps baseball could fill that void. But basketball called him back, and when he returned, it was as if the sport had become an inescapable part of his soul. But now, as time went on, he felt that part of himself slipping into the past. The transition to life after basketball wasn't as easy as some might have imagined. Jordan had achieved everything there was to achieve in the sport, and yet there was still something missing. He had won titles, made history, become a global icon, but now, in the stillness of retirement, the question was no longer how to be great at basketball, but how to find greatness in something else. It wasn't as if he was struggling. He had built an empire outside the game, his business ventures were thriving, and his ownership stake in the Charlotte Hornets provided him with a new outlet to stay connected to the sport. But it was different now. The pressure to perform, to win, to lead, was gone. The adrenaline that had once flooded his veins every time he stepped onto the court was absent. For the first time in decades, he didn't have that rush of competition driving him forward. The closest he could come to feeling that again was through the players he mentored or the young talent he watched, but it was still different. The stage had changed. He spent more time with his family, something he had sacrificed so much for during his career. His children were growing up, and the moments that had passed him by when he was younger were now opportunities to be a present father, to be the kind of dad he had wanted to be when he was still playing. He found joy in the small things, the family dinners, the quiet afternoons, the walks through his property. But there was still that gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. Could he ever be content with just being Michael Jordan, the man? Was it possible to live outside the game that had given him everything? One afternoon, as he sat on his porch overlooking the rolling hills of his estate, Jordan thought about the legacy he had built. It wasn't just the championships, the MVPs, or the endorsement deals. It wasn't even the recognition he had gotten over the years as the greatest player of all time. The legacy he had left was the inspiration. The way he had changed the way people looked at the game. The way he had pushed his teammates, his rivals, and himself to reach new heights. It had always been about more than just winning for Jordan. It was about being the best, not for the sake of personal glory, but for the sake of the game itself. He had elevated the NBA, turning it into a global spectacle, transforming basketball into something that went beyond borders and language barriers. He had inspired millions, not just with his talent, but with his work ethic, his mentality, and his relentless drive. He had shown the world that greatness wasn't just about talent, it was about the effort you were willing to put in, the sacrifices you were willing to make, and the belief you had in yourself when no one else did. But even with all that, there was still something that kept pulling at him. Something that told him he wasn't finished yet. It wasn't about basketball. It wasn't about records. It was about something deeper. It was about how to channel the fire that had driven him for so long into something that could impact the world in a different way. In the years after his retirement, Jordan began to reflect on his own life, the mistakes, the missteps, and the moments of clarity. He had always been so focused on the next victory, the next challenge, that he had never fully allowed himself to be vulnerable. He had built walls around himself, walls that protected the image he had worked so hard to create. He had allowed his competitive nature to consume him, and in doing so, he had lost touch with parts of himself that had been neglected. But now, with time on his side, Jordan could see the whole picture. He could see the flaws and the greatness that existed side by side in his journey. There were moments he wasn't proud of, times when he pushed his teammates too hard, when he prioritized the game over his family, when his obsession with winning took precedence over his own well-being. But those moments were part of his story. They were part of the man he had become, and they were something he could no longer ignore. That realization wasn't easy. For so long, he had believed that perfection was the key to greatness, that to be the best, he had to be flawless. But now, in the quiet of his retirement, he understood that greatness didn't come from being perfect. It came from being authentic, from embracing the challenges and the mistakes, and from growing through them. It came from understanding that the journey wasn't just about the destination, it was about who you became along the way. In the years following his departure from the court, Jordan's work began to shift. He spent more time mentoring younger players, using his experience to guide them not just on the court, but off it. He spoke at events, sharing his story, his challenges, and his triumphs in a way that was more personal, more human. He had always been an icon, someone who seemed untouchable, but now, he opened up in ways he never had before. He wasn't just Michael Jordan, the basketball player. He was Michael Jordan, the mentor, the businessman, the father, the man who had learned from his mistakes and found a new purpose outside the game. One of the most fulfilling aspects of his post-retirement life was his ownership stake in the Charlotte Hornets. The team had become his new passion, not just as an owner but as someone who truly cared about the future of the sport. He wanted to make a difference, not just in the game, but in the lives of the players who came after him. He shared his knowledge, his insights, and his experience with the next generation, teaching them that greatness was more than just physical ability. It was about heart, dedication, and mental toughness. It was about understanding that the game would one day end, but the lessons learned along the way would last forever. And so, in his later years, Michael Jordan continued to shape the game, but now, it was not through his own on-court greatness. It was through his ability to guide, to mentor, and to inspire. The pressure was gone. The competition was over. And in the quiet peace of his retirement, Jordan found a new purpose, one that allowed him to pass on the lessons he had learned and to leave a legacy that went beyond the hardwood. Michael Jordan sat in his office, looking out over the cityscape that stretched beyond the windows. The sun had just started to set, casting a warm glow across the skyline. The world had continued moving forward, as it always did, while he had paused to reflect on his past. The NBA had evolved, and new stars had risen, but his place in the history of the sport was permanent. Yet, the question of what came next still lingered. Retirement had allowed him to find peace, but in that stillness, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. He had achieved everything there was to achieve in basketball, but how would his legacy evolve? When he had stepped away from the court for the last time, he had done so with an understanding that it was time to leave behind the pressures of being the greatest player to ever play the game. But now, years into retirement, he began to realize that the game had always been a part of him, and that part would never fully fade. Basketball had given him an identity, a purpose, a platform. It had shaped him, but now, he had to find out what was next for the man who had once been the face of the NBA. The transition from the court to the boardroom had been a natural one in many ways. Jordan had always been competitive, and his ventures in business were no different. He had worked hard to build his brand, and his successful collaboration with Nike had cemented his status as a global icon. He was more than just an athlete, he was a businessman, a cultural figure, and someone who had transcended sports. But despite all the success, there was still something missing. The competition had been his life, but now, there was no scoreboard, no clock ticking down, no opponent to outmatch. The challenges he faced were of a different kind, figuring out how to build something lasting, how to make an impact in ways that went beyond basketball. He had used his platform to influence the game, to inspire players and fans alike, but now he sought a new kind of influence. His time on the court had shaped who he was, but now he was exploring who he could become outside of it. Jordan had always been driven, but this new pursuit felt different. It wasn't about proving himself. It wasn't about being the best. It was about giving back, mentoring, and finding ways to help others achieve their own dreams. For so long, he had been the one others looked up to, the one who had set the standard for excellence. Now, he wanted to pass that knowledge on to those who would follow in his footsteps. He had already started doing so, especially with his involvement in the Charlotte Hornets. As the principal owner of the team, Jordan had become a mentor to the young players in a way that transcended basketball. He knew that being a great player was about more than just the game. It was about mental toughness, discipline, and the ability to push through adversity. These were lessons that went far beyond the court, and he was determined to help the next generation of athletes understand that. It wasn't just about the physical aspects of the sport, it was about what made a person great, both on and off the floor. Yet, as much as Jordan had given to others, there was still a part of him that wondered if he had truly given enough. His second retirement had come with a sense of finality, but also with a recognition that there was more he could do. As he continued to look at the world through the lens of his legacy, Jordan realized that his work had only just begun. He had always been the man who was driven by competition, by the desire to be the best. But now, in the quieter moments, he understood that his greatest challenge would be finding purpose outside of the game. It wasn't easy. The hunger that had driven him on the court was still present, though it had shifted. Now, his focus was on building a legacy that could last beyond his playing days. He had already changed the game of basketball, but now, he wanted to change the world. His business ventures, his philanthropy, and his ownership stake in the Hornets were all part of that process. But there was more. He had come to understand that greatness wasn't defined by the accolades and trophies. It was defined by the impact you had on the lives of others, by the way you shaped the world around you. His work with young players, whether through his direct involvement with the Hornets or his mentorship of players around the league, became a source of fulfillment. Jordan had always led by example, but now, he led with intention. He was no longer just a player giving everything to win, he was someone who was helping to shape the future of the game. And, in a way, this new role was just as important as the one he had held as a player. He could see the impact he was having, and it was a source of pride. The competitive spirit that had defined him for so long had found a new outlet, one where he didn't have to compete with other players, but where he could still drive success through his influence. In the years following his retirement, Jordan began to focus more on his philanthropy as well. He had always been a private man, but now, he found himself looking for ways to give back on a larger scale. He had built an empire, but it was time to use that power to make a real difference. His work with children's hospitals, his donations to education programs, and his efforts to improve communities became some of the most meaningful aspects of his post-retirement life. For the first time, he could see that the things he had done off the court, helping others, providing opportunities, were just as impactful as anything he had done on it. Jordan often found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned from the game. They weren't just about winning or losing, they were about resilience, about overcoming obstacles, and about being true to yourself, no matter what others thought. He had always been someone who thrived in the spotlight, but he had come to understand that it was just as important to give back to those who helped him along the way. And as he worked on his various projects, he knew that he was building something much bigger than himself. His legacy would not just be defined by basketball but by the positive change he had brought into the world. As he sat in his office, thinking about the road ahead, Jordan couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had done more than anyone could have imagined. But more than that, he had learned how to lead with compassion, to mentor, and to give back in ways that extended beyond the game. The man who had once been defined by his drive to be the best was now someone who was defined by his willingness to help others achieve greatness. And in that, he found a new sense of purpose, one that was just as fulfilling as any championship. It wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about the people he had touched, the players he had inspired, and the impact he had made on the world. As he looked out at the horizon, Jordan knew that the journey wasn't over. The game had given him everything, but now, he was giving back in ways that would outlast any championship ring. His legacy wasn't just in the records he had broken or the titles he had won. It was in the lives he had changed, the lives he was still changing, and the impact he would continue to have on the world for years to come. The years since his final retirement had been filled with a new kind of challenge. Michael Jordan had become something more than just a basketball legend. He had been molded by the game, shaped by the triumphs and the struggles, and now, after stepping away, he had discovered a different side of himself. He had walked away from the sport that had defined him for so long, but the echoes of that life never truly disappeared. Still, as time passed, Jordan had come to embrace his new role as a mentor, a businessman, and a philanthropist. He had always been driven, but now, that drive had found a new direction. His success off the court had been undeniable. His ventures with Nike, his role as the owner of the Charlotte Hornets, and his expanding philanthropic efforts had brought him an entirely different kind of fulfillment. It wasn't about the trophies anymore, but about the impact he had on the lives of others. The change in his life had been gradual but profound. For so long, he had been the player everyone looked to for greatness, but now, he had become the person others turned to for guidance, for wisdom, for strength. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, Jordan reflected on everything he had accomplished. The world had changed since he first burst onto the NBA scene, but the impact of his career still resonated. It wasn't just the records or the championships, it was the inspiration he had sparked in others. It was the way he had pushed the boundaries of what was possible and showed the world that greatness could be achieved not just by talent, but by the relentless pursuit of perfection. But now, it wasn't about showing the world how great he was. It was about showing the next generation how to be great in their own right. He thought about the players he had mentored over the years, guys who had come to him for advice, for guidance, for help in navigating the pressures of professional sports. He saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire he had once had when he was trying to make his mark on the game. And as he thought about the legacy he had left on the court, Jordan realized that his true legacy was not just in the games he had played, but in the players he had helped along the way. It wasn't always easy. He wasn't a coach, and his approach was often intense. He didn't believe in coddling players, he believed in pushing them to their limits, demanding the best from them. But as he had seen over the years, the results spoke for themselves. Those players who had accepted the challenge, who had embraced the lessons he had imparted, had gone on to make their own mark on the game. They were champions in their own right, and Jordan knew that his influence had played a role in their success. But there was more to it than that. The satisfaction he found in mentoring and guiding others went beyond the game itself. In helping others rise, he had found a new purpose, one that didn't rely on the spotlight or the constant attention that had once consumed his every move. He could see the bigger picture now. His legacy wasn't just in his individual accomplishments, it was in the way he had helped others achieve their own greatness. As he sat back in his chair, Jordan smiled. He wasn't done yet. The game might have ended for him, but life was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still opportunities to seize. And as he looked out over the city, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. His life after basketball had been about finding balance, about rediscovering himself outside the world of competition. He had built a new life, a life where he was not defined by the scores or the stats, but by the relationships he had formed and the impact he had made. The game had been his everything, but it no longer consumed him. He had learned to be Michael Jordan, not just the player, but the man who had used his platform to make a difference. He thought about the moments in his life that had shaped him, the struggles, the losses, the moments when it felt like the world was against him. He thought about how he had risen above those moments, always finding a way to push forward, to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. It was that perseverance, that unwavering belief in himself, that had defined him as a player. And it was that same belief that continued to drive him now, even as he stepped away from the game. As the years had passed, Jordan had come to terms with the fact that there would never be another career quite like his. The history he had made was permanent. But what had truly shaped his legacy was the impact he had on those who came after him. He had shown them what was possible when you believed in yourself, when you worked tirelessly to achieve greatness. And in doing so, he had created a path for others to follow. But now, as he sat in his office, watching the sunset over the city, Jordan understood something deeper. His story had never been about basketball alone. It had always been about the human spirit, about the will to overcome, to push beyond the limits. It had been about showing the world that anything was possible if you were willing to sacrifice and work for it. And that, he realized, was the true essence of his legacy. The world would always remember him as one of the greatest players to ever live. But Jordan knew that the most important thing he could do was to continue to live with purpose, to keep finding ways to inspire and lead, to continue to make a difference. He had built his empire, but it was time to start thinking about what came next. The competitive fire still burned within him, but it had found a new focus. As the evening settled in and the last light of the day disappeared behind the horizon, Jordan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been his home for so many years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm. He had done everything he set out to do, and now he could focus on the next phase of his life. Whatever that might look like, he was ready for it. The game had given him everything, but the real work was only just beginning. Michael Jordan had always been defined by his relentless pursuit of greatness. But now, in this quiet moment, he understood that greatness wasn't just about what you achieved, it was about what you left behind. And with that understanding, Jordan was ready to take the next step, knowing that his legacy would continue to inspire, to challenge, and to change the world.